One alternative to the Rosenberg approach is not to make the courts the primary actors, because I think many of us would agree that he's right. Can courts as agents of social change make a big difference? And he's right. Courts tend to be quite conservative, especially throughout American history. The period of the 1950s through the 1980s was a relatively unusual period where the court was aligned with what we might call a liberal or progressive kinds of change. That's not been the primary role of the courts. But even during that time, one could argue that what they did was very cautious and largely in conformity with what other branches and other powerful players in American politics wanted. So instead of focusing on courts as the initiators of change and the agents, most of my work is about litigation. Litigation as a process that involves many other kinds of actors and has many other dynamics that don't necessarily turn on the actions of the courts or their capacity to implement and enforce what it is that they do. For example, some work that I have done shows that winning in court is not necessarily the most important way to use litigation. Often losing in court can be very useful. It can dramatize a social problem, generate a lot of media attention, and then provide an incentive or a catalyst for other actors to take up the cause, whether it's a legislature or so forth. And when that happens, that's actually more effective because legislatures do have the tools of enforcement, particularly through control over money and so forth, to make for effective kind of change. Many times when people file lawsuits, those suits often don't go to trial, don't go to a final judgment, whether it's at the appellate level of the Supreme Court or whether it's at a lower court. But in the process of filing litigation, that can add significant, what I call leveraging power to advocates for particular kinds of changes. Just filing a lawsuit can get the attention of adversaries or opponents, can dramatize an issue, can mobilize media support under certain conditions, can mobilize other groups to come to follow behind in support of an issue, and that what began as a case of litigation can turn into change again at other levels, legislative levels, or just change in practices quite directly without ever even falling through the lawsuit. But the key to that is to focus on litigation, those who are advocating change, to interrogate what it is they're trying to do, and to look at the ways in which they use litigation or coordinate litigation with other kinds of political tactics, such as legislative activity, interest group lobbying, social movement activity, media, courting the media for attention, those kinds of things. But by shifting from the courts as agents of change to groups or social agents, which often involve and may feature prominently lawyers, one gets a more dynamic and complex kind of picture about a politics of rights advocacy or a politics of what I call legal mobilization.